Michael Turner had never been a man who sought attention, and by the time he reached his late 60s, he had already built a life that was defined by silence, routine, and the subtle discipline that came with being both an architect by profession and a widower by fate. His home, a modest but carefully designed two-story structure at the edge of a suburban cul-de-sac, was the last real project of his career, the place where he allowed himself the freedom to combine practicality with quiet elegance. To most of the neighbors it looked like a slightly old-fashioned house, a little too angular, a little too stubborn in its refusal to mimic the glossy designs that dominated the gated community. To Michael, it was a fortress, not in the sense of keeping people out, but in the sense of containing memories, ideas, and the independence that had been his only reliable companion since his wife had passed away years earlier. What distinguished his property most of all, however, was not the design of the house, but the system that powered it. Long before solar panels became fashionable and battery walls were sold as lifestyle accessories, Michael had been working on an independent energy project for himself, a hybrid of panels, underground cabling, and a backup generator that he had tinkered with for decades. He had once designed emergency infrastructure for military outposts and refugee facilities, and the remnants of that knowledge had never left him. When he retired, he redirected all of it into his home, so that when storms rolled through and the grid failed, his lights stayed on and his appliances never faltered. It was not arrogance that drove him, but a conviction that dependence made people weak, and if life had taught him anything, it was that weakness was quickly exploited. Directly across the street stood the Holloway Mansion, a sprawling structure of stone and glass that towered over every other property in the neighborhood, a house that looked less like a residence and more like a museum someone had decided to live in. Karen Holloway, the widow of a construction magnate, kept the place lit like an exhibition, chandeliers glowing late into the night, outdoor lights bathing the yard in a steady golden haze, and ornamental lanterns marking the driveway as if she were hosting perpetual galas. She had a reputation for never letting anything go unchallenged, and in the delicate ecosystem of suburban politics, she thrived on being the arbiter of taste, the self-appointed guardian of rules, appearances, and what she liked to call community standards. From the day Michael moved in, she regarded his home with suspicion, convinced that his refusal to conform to the manicured sterility of the neighborhood was a form of rebellion against her sense of order. When his solar panels were first installed, she complained that they reflected sunlight into her windows. When he constructed a reinforced shed to house his generator, she suggested that it clashed with the landscape. When she saw him adjusting wiring on weekends, she made pointed remarks about unlicensed work and the dangers of faulty electricity. To outsiders, her criticisms might have sounded like idle gossip, but to Michael they carried the unmistakable edge of hostility, the kind that never faded but instead accumulated until it became part of the air one breathed. Michael endured her comments with the same patience he had developed over years of dealing with demanding clients and bureaucratic city inspectors, never rising to her provocations, never lowering himself to her level of pettiness. Yet he was not naive, and he recognized the way she used her influence to sway neighbors, the way her carefully curated charm allowed her to plant seeds of doubt about him in conversations at the homeowner association meetings. Some nodded politely, others shrugged, but he noticed the glances, the half-smiles that masked unease, the faint hesitation when he greeted them during his evening walks. It did not trouble him the way it might have troubled someone who thrived on approval, but it did confirm what he had always known, that Karen Holloway would never stop attempting to assert control over everything around her, even when it extended beyond her property line. For Michael, the house was not just walls and windows. It was the last place where his wife's presence lingered. In the photographs along the staircase, in the kitchen she had insisted on designing herself. In the garden she once tended with hands that had long since turned to dust. Every nail he hammered into the panels, every adjustment he made to the generator, felt like a conversation with her, a continuation of the life they had begun together but which he now carried forward alone. That gave his independence a weight Karen could not understand. She saw panels and wires, he saw continuity and resilience. She saw a stubborn old man clinging to outdated methods. He saw the only way to live without relying on a world that was too quick to take everything from you. It was this divide, more than aesthetics or petty disputes, that set them on a path toward collision. Karen was not the type to confront openly unless she was certain she could win, and Michael knew enough about people like her to sense that her disapproval was not just idle dislike, but the first rumble of something larger. In neighborhoods like theirs, power was exercised not through violence but through rules, committees, whispers, and paperwork, and he suspected that sooner or later she would use all of them against him. What he could not foresee, standing at his window on a quiet summer night while his generator hummed softly in the background, was how far she would go to make her point, and how a simple cable buried beneath the soil would become the battlefield on which both of them would test the limits of control, defiance, and survival. The storm came without warning, the kind of storm that seemed to roll out of nowhere, black clouds folding over one another like a collapsing wall and winds strong enough to rattle window frames and bend tree limbs in half. By the time evening settled, the entire neighborhood was plunged into chaos. Power lines swayed dangerously overhead. Transformers crackled with blue flashes, and then, as if the entire grid exhaled at once, everything went dark. Across the cul-de-sac, houses fell silent, one by one, their televisions and appliances going dead, their lights extinguished, and within minutes the street was nothing but a corridor of shadows broken only by the occasional flicker of lightning. All except Michael's house. He had been waiting for this moment, not with excitement, but with the calm satisfaction of a man whose foresight had prepared him for precisely such an event. His generator engaged seamlessly, his solar reserves filled the gaps, and the hum of energy filled his home with a steady reassurance. The lights glowed warmly in every room, his refrigerator continued its steady vibration, and even the air inside carried the faint rhythm of continuity. Outside, however, the contrast was stark. The Turner home stood out like a lantern on a battlefield of darkness, a lone beacon in an otherwise dead neighborhood. Karen Holloway saw it too. From the tall windows of her mansion she could see Michael's house glowing, not harshly but distinctly, the only proof of the life on the block. She had spent her evening pacing the halls of her massive, suddenly useless residence, her chandeliers hanging silent and her appliances frozen in stillness. For a woman who had always measured her existence by the glow of control, the darkness was unbearable. She lit candles but found them weak and primitive, their flames trembling against the vast ceilings. She fumbled with her phone, but its battery was draining, and without Wi-Fi, her calls felt pointless. Each glance outside at Michael's illuminated windows was a cut to her pride. To her mind, his house was mocking hers, flaunting independence, undermining the quiet hierarchy of the neighborhood. And though the storm passed and the silence deepened, the wound she felt did not fade. By dawn, she had already decided that the situation could not be tolerated, that his stubborn insistence on being different would not go unanswered. The next day, Michael went about his morning as usual. He brewed coffee, read through old architectural sketches he had been revisiting for pleasure, and checked the readings of his energy system with the meticulousness of habit. Everything worked as intended, which gave him a small but satisfying sense of triumph. Yet, when he stepped outside to inspect the panels, his eyes caught something unusual near the edge of his property, the faint disturbance of soil, a thin scar in the earth where the grass had been pressed down. He crouched, touched the ground, and felt a slight roughness where a shovel or blade might have disturbed the dirt. At first he dismissed it as storm damage, but later, while inspecting the main line that connected his generator to the house, he saw it. A clean, deliberate cut in the insulation. Wires severed with the precision of a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. He traced the line back, noting the unnatural sharpness of the cut. This was no accident, no fallen branch, no random debris. Someone had been here. He stood there for a long moment, the quiet of the morning pressing around him, and considered his options. To repair it was simple enough. He had done much harder work under far less forgiving conditions. But the discovery was not about labor. It was about intent. The storm had given someone cover, an excuse to move unnoticed, and the damage was too exact to be mistaken for nature's work. He thought of the eyes that had glared across the street, the disapproving remarks about illegal systems and safety hazards, the way Karen's mansion had sat in darkness while his own house glowed like a challenge. He could almost imagine her voice, clipped and rehearsed, saying that his arrogance needed to be put in check. Yet suspicion alone meant nothing. Without proof, he would sound paranoid, another eccentric homeowner ranting about conspiracies. And so he said nothing, not even to the few neighbors he greeted when they stepped out to collect fallen branches from their yards. He repaired the line silently, hands steady, jaw tight, eyes scanning the street, not for danger, but for the confirmation that somewhere, someone had already decided to turn irritation into sabotage. That night he made a habit of walking the perimeter of his property, flashlight in hand, checking not just the wiring, but the soil, the fence, and the corners where shadows lingered longer than they should. The house, once a sanctuary, suddenly felt like territory under observation. He did not imagine sounds or shapes. He was too disciplined for that. But there was a subtle change in the atmosphere, a sense that the ordinary rhythm of his quiet evenings had been breached. His memories of past projects returned to him. The training to notice the smallest detail, the way soldiers would sometimes sabotage systems not to destroy them entirely, but to send a message. That was what this was. Not an attempt to cripple his home, but to remind him that independence came with consequences. And when he looked across the street and saw Karen's darkened mansion looming, its windows reflecting the faint glow of his own lights, he felt not satisfaction, but an unease that settled deep into his chest. The following day he found another sign, subtle but clear, a set of faint footprints in the softened soil near the back fence, too large for a child, too fresh to have been left by chance. He crouched and measured them with his hand, tracing their direction. They led not out, but in, crossing into his yard from the very strip of pavement that connected his property line to Karen's. He did not take photographs, did not call the police, did not speak a word of it to anyone. Instead, he returned inside, locked the doors, and sat at his desk staring at the blueprints of his house as if the answer to intrusion could be found in lines and measurements. He told himself that the act of sabotage had been symbolic, that the intent was intimidation rather than destruction. But symbolism had its own danger, and messages left unanswered had a way of growing louder with time. In the days that followed, neighbors complained about the blackout, about spoiled food, about the inconvenience of waiting for the utility company to repair lines. Karen's voice was the loudest, her complaints sharpened with the suggestion that perhaps independent systems like Michael's were dangerous or illegal. She spoke not directly to him but within earshot. To anyone who would listen, her words aimed, like arrows disguised as observations. Michael said nothing, but in the silence he felt the tension stretching thinner, a thread that would inevitably snap. For him, the blackout had been a confirmation of his foresight, proof that independence mattered. For her, it had been humiliation, a blow to her pride. And humiliation was not something Karen Holloway ever allowed to pass unanswered. The cut cable was not the end, but the beginning. And as Michael sat by his window on another quiet night, he knew with the certainty of instinct that the storm had not simply passed through their neighborhood. It had rearranged the balance of power, and what came next would be darker than the blackout itself. Michael repaired the damaged line with a craftsman's precision, stripping insulation, soldering wires, and sealing them within reinforced casing, so that even if someone tried again, it would not be so easy to cut. The work itself calmed him, reminding him of the discipline of architecture, the slow patience of problem-solving. Yet beneath the surface there was a current of anger, a pressure he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. He had built this house to withstand storms, bureaucrats, and time itself, but he had not imagined that the real threat would come from across the street, from a neighbor who considered herself entitled to control the world around her. He told himself to be rational, that the evidence was circumstantial, but the footprints by the fence lingered in his memory, as did the deliberate sharpness of the severed line. He had spent his life reading structures, systems, and patterns, and the pattern here was undeniable. Someone wanted to remind him that autonomy had a price. That night, as he walked his yard again, the hum of the generator steady in the background, an idea began to form. He would not retaliate with anger, nor would he lower himself to direct confrontation that would only serve to feed Karen's theatrics. Instead, he would do what he had always done best, use design, light, and proportion to deliver a message that was impossible to ignore. He pulled from storage a set of heavy architectural spotlights he had once used during a presentation of an unfinished museum project. They were not decorative garden lights, but industrial instruments designed to flood facades with brilliance. Over the next day, he adjusted wiring, ran cables through weatherproof conduits, and connected the lights directly to his backup system. By dusk, when the sky darkened and the neighborhood was once again quiet, Michael aligned the fixtures toward the Holloway mansion, calculated their angles, and with a flick of a switch, transformed her stone facade into a glaring stage. The beams of light were not blinding, but they stripped her house of shadow, bathing every column and window in a stark glow that made privacy impossible. For Michael, it was not revenge, but architecture as protest, illumination as defiance. Karen noticed immediately. Curtains fluttered, a door slammed, and within minutes her figure appeared across the street, moving swiftly down her driveway, her face sharpened by the harsh contrast of the lights. She crossed into his yard without hesitation, her heels crunching against gravel, and banged her fist on his door with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. When Michael opened, she did not bother with pleasantries. "You think this is clever?" she demanded, her voice tight, her silhouette framed by the glare that now made her mansion look more like a monument under siege than a home. "This circus act of yours. You've turned my property into a spectacle, and I won't stand for it." Michael regarded her calmly, leaning against the frame, his expression unyielding. "I simply thought it was a shame for such a grand structure to be lost in the dark. Illumination brings out detail. You should appreciate that as much as anyone." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't mock me. This ends tonight. You'll take those lights down, or I'll see to it that you regret every hour you've spent in this neighborhood." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, thrusting it into his hand with a performative gesture. "This is a notice from the Homeowner Association. Your system is unauthorized, your generator violates safety regulations, and your installation of outdoor floodlights breaches community standards. You have 1 week to remove them." Michael unfolded the paper and scanned it. At first glance it looked official, with a header, a seal, and a signature. But the architect in him saw immediately what an ordinary eye might have missed. The font in the header mismatched the body text, the seal was blurred as though copied from a scanned image, and the date at the bottom referred to a month that did not even align with the HOA's meeting calendar. It was a forgery, sloppy in its haste but arrogant in its intent, and Karen delivered it with the confidence of someone who believed appearances were enough to intimidate. Michael raised his eyes from the paper and met her stare. "You should be more careful," he said quietly. "Authenticity is a matter of detail. This doesn't even pass the most basic scrutiny." For the first time, her expression faltered, though she recovered quickly, drawing herself up with that familiar air of superiority. "You can play games with your wires and your little tricks, but you're not above the rules. You're an old man with too much time on his hands, and sooner or later someone will put you in your place." She turned sharply and walked back into the flood of light that now made her retreat look like the exit of an actress leaving a stage. When she disappeared into her mansion and the door slammed behind her, Michael remained in the doorway, the forged notice still in his hand. He felt no triumph, only the confirmation that what had begun with a cut cable was now escalating into something more deliberate, more dangerous. Karen had moved beyond complaints and whispers. She had crossed into deception, using false authority as a weapon. And if she was willing to falsify documents, what else might she be willing to do? He folded the paper carefully, slid it into a drawer inside his study, and sat at his desk with the heavy realization that the quiet balance of his life was gone. He was no longer simply maintaining his independence. He was defending it against someone who would stop at nothing to see it dismantled. And as the lights continued to blaze against her mansion across the street, Michael understood that this was no longer about electricity or aesthetics. It was about control, about pride, and about how far one neighbor was willing to go to erase another's defiance. Michael had never been a man to seek conflict, and even as the tension with Karen sharpened into something undeniable, he tried to approach it as he would any difficult project in his professional past, by stepping back, studying the lines and structures, searching for the flaw hidden in plain sight. The forged HOA notice she had thrust into his hands was crude enough to expose itself, but its existence unsettled him more than if it had been convincing. People forged documents only when they believed themselves above consequence, and Karen's confidence suggested that she had someone helping her, someone who knew enough about the machinery of bureaucracy to imitate it badly. He placed the fake notice in a folder and told himself he would not go looking for trouble. But trouble had already crossed his boundary, and the act of pretending otherwise was no longer an option. He began to watch not just Karen, but the rhythms of her house, the lights that flickered on when they should not, the vehicles that came and went at hours no ordinary household required, and the unfamiliar male figure who had started to appear more often at her side. He first noticed the man in the early morning, just before sunrise, when the neighborhood was still and the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Michael had been walking the edge of his yard, checking the soil for signs of tampering, when he saw movement across the street. A tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket, stepped out of Karen's side entrance carrying what looked like a heavy case. He placed it into the trunk of a car that Michael had never seen before, and drove off without turning on his headlights until he reached the main road. The precision of the movement, the deliberate silence, unsettled Michael more than the sight itself. This was not a nephew or a casual visitor. This was someone who knew how to move unseen, and the memory of the cut power line returned to him with the weight of confirmation. Later that week, while disposing of trash at the community bins near the end of the street, Michael spotted something half-hidden beneath cardboard, a discarded box that had once contained electrical tools of a professional grade, the sort used by contractors or linemen. The label was smudged but still legible, and across the side in black marker was scrawled a name, Ethan R. It meant nothing to him at first, but when he turned the box over and saw fragments of insulation shavings inside, the pieces began to align. He left the box where it was, unwilling to take evidence that was not his, but he carried the name back with him like a splinter beneath the skin. That evening, as he sat at his desk with the forged notice in front of him, the name Ethan R. written on the margin of a notepad, he realized the conflict was not simply between himself and Karen. She had help, and the help came from someone with access to tools, knowledge, and a reason to hide behind anonymity. The breakthrough came when he decided, against his usual instincts, to pay a visit to the HOA office. He disliked those places with their rows of pamphlets about community regulations and their air of petty authority, but he needed to test Karen's lie against the real machinery of record-keeping. He brought the forged notice with him, folded neatly inside a folder, and waited while the receptionist leafed through files. She looked at the document, frowned, and shook her head. There had been no such notice issued, no meeting that matched the date, No directive signed by the president whose signature had been crudely imitated. "This isn't ours," she said finally, sliding the paper back across the counter with an edge of discomfort. "Who gave this to you?" Michael studied her face, and though her voice was neutral, he saw the flicker of recognition when he mentioned the name scrawled on the discarded box. Her posture stiffened, her eyes darted away, and for a second too long she said nothing. Then, with a quick shake of her head, she told him she didn't know anyone by that name. The denial was too quick, too rehearsed, and as Michael left the office he carried with him the sense that the problem extended further than Karen's personal vendetta. That night he sat by his window again, the lights of his house steady, the Holloway mansion dark except for a faint glow in the back rooms where curtains were always drawn. He thought of Ethan R., of the receptionist's nervous glance, of the way Karen had delivered the forged notice with a certainty that came from more than arrogance. He thought of how his system had been targeted not once but twice, not to destroy it completely but to remind him that it could be touched, tampered with, diminished. And he realized then that what he faced was not just a neighbor's resentment, but a collaboration, a kind of alliance between her and a man who seemed to exist only at the edges of legitimacy. Karen was not foolish enough to dig into wires herself. She had someone who could. The next morning, as he sipped coffee on his porch, he saw the man again. Ethan, if that was his name, was standing in Karen's driveway speaking with her in low tones. Michael observed the stiffness of their interaction, the way Karen gestured toward his house with a sharp motion, the way Ethan's hands remained in his pockets, expressionless, unmoved. This was not family. This was an arrangement, and Karen was paying or sheltering him for services Michael did not yet fully understand. When they noticed him watching, Ethan's head turned slightly, his gaze resting on Michael with a flatness that was not hostile, but assessing, as if calculating how much of a problem he would be. Then he turned away, stepped into the house, and disappeared. Karen followed, closing the door behind her with the finality of a stage curtain falling. For the first time in years, Michael felt the unease of being drawn into something he could not fully chart. It was not paranoia, but architecture. Every structure had a hidden load, every foundation a point of stress, and here the stress line ran straight through his independence. He began to keep more detailed notes, logging times, vehicles, and movements, not to present to police or HOA, but for himself, so that the shape of the conflict could be measured. The more he wrote, the clearer it became that Karen was no longer acting alone, and the man without documents was not just a shadow but a lever she used to press against him. And though the neighborhood still treated her with deference, still believed her charm and her complaints, Michael could already see the fracture line forming beneath the polished surface of her life. When he closed his notebook that night and shut off the desk lamp, he told himself what he had once told younger architects when they faced an impossible project. The structure always reveals itself under pressure, and Karen Holloway, with her false notices and her silent accomplice, was under pressure now. The question was not whether she would reveal her weakness, but when, and whether Michael would be ready when she did. Michael had lived long enough to recognize the difference between irritation and escalation, and by the time a second forged complaint arrived at his doorstep, he knew Karen had crossed into territory that was not just vindictive, but calculated. The paper bore the same mismatched font and smudged seal as before, but this time it accused him not merely of violating community lighting rules, but of operating a hazardous system that posed a fire risk to the neighborhood. It demanded immediate disconnection and removal of all his backup equipment, citing sections of bylaws that did not even exist. The absurdity of the claim would have been laughable if not for the knowledge that most of his neighbors, uninterested in detail, would take the paper at face value. People believed authority when it arrived in print, and Karen was counting on that. He placed the document on his desk next to the earlier forgery, the two of them side by side like cheap replicas of something real, and felt the quiet weight of inevitability pressing down on him. The next days revealed the depth of her maneuvering. Neighbors who had once greeted him politely now looked at him with unease, murmuring about generators that might explode, wires that could spark. At the local coffee shop, he overheard two residents whispering that Turner's house was an accident waiting to happen, that his obsession with independence had blinded him to safety. He did not confront them, but the words told him what he already suspected. Karen had begun a campaign of rumor, and Ethan, if that was indeed the shadow behind her curtain, was the one providing the veneer of technical credibility. She would say, with carefully chosen words, that she had consulted someone with expertise, and neighbors, trusting her widow's charm and gracious tone, believed it. Lies gained weight when draped in the appearance of concern. Michael chose not to respond with arguments or protests. He had no interest in lowering himself into her theater of whispers. Instead, he returned to the discipline that had always sustained him: careful observation and patient preparation. He reviewed every inch of his system, double-checked wiring, and reinforced casings not because they were faulty but because he wanted certainty. If she or her accomplice tried again, they would find his work far more difficult to sabotage. He documented everything, not in anticipation of persuading the HOA, but for his own integrity. He had learned long ago that the only defense against lies was evidence strong enough to outlast them. But Karen was not content with rumor alone. One evening, as Michael returned from a supply store, he noticed a small group gathered near the edge of the cul-de-sac. Karen stood at the center, speaking with her trademark authority, holding a clipboard that glinted under the streetlight. He did not need to approach to know what it was. A petition. Her gestures toward his house, the way the neighbors leaned closer, the occasional nods of reluctant agreement. It was all a familiar choreography of coercion. She was mobilizing them, gathering signatures to pressure the HOA formally, cloaking her vendetta in the language of community safety. He paused long enough for her to see him, long enough for the silence between them to stretch across the street like a drawn wire. And then he walked past without a word. Her smile widened in response, a smile not of welcome but of triumph, as if to remind him that her power was not in truth but in numbers. That night, the mansion across the street blazed with light again, though the power grid had long since been restored. Michael noticed the unnatural glow from his window and realized with a jolt of cold clarity that her electricity was not coming from the utility lines. Somewhere, somehow, she and Ethan had tapped into his system. It explained the faint fluctuations he had observed in his readings, the subtle dips in stored power that had not matched his calculations. They had not only sabotaged him, they were stealing from him, parasitically tethered to the very independence she mocked. The realization twisted something deep inside him, not anger, but a steadier resolve. It was no longer about a feud over aesthetics or rules. She had crossed into theft, and theft required exposure. He did not storm across the street or pound on her door. He did what he always did. He documented. He traced the wiring, found where soil had been disturbed along the boundary line, and uncovered the splice that connected her mansion to his generator. The work was clever, done with professional hands, but not clever enough to escape the eye of an architect who had spent his life reading the language of hidden structures. He photographed it all with an old camera he trusted more than phones, dated the images, and stored them in a fireproof box. Then he sealed the splice, cutting off her illicit connection, and waited. The reaction came swiftly. Within hours, Karen appeared in his driveway, her steps sharp, her posture brittle with fury. "My house has lost power again," she said, her voice trembling with the effort to mask rage. "And I know you had something to do with it." Michael regarded her evenly, his face unreadable. "Perhaps you should check your wiring," he answered. "It seems you have someone advising you who isn't as skilled as he pretends." For a moment, her composure cracked, the mask slipping just enough for the truth to surface. She knew he knew. But she recovered, lips tightening into a smile too brittle to be genuine. "You won't win this," she said, lowering her voice to a near whisper. You think your little fortress makes you untouchable, but everyone has a weakness." She turned and walked away, leaving the words like a stain on the air. Michael watched her retreat without moving. He felt no fear in the threat itself, but he recognized the pattern. She was desperate now, cornered, and desperation bred recklessness. The conflict had grown beyond rumor, beyond forged notices, beyond neighborhood politics. It was a contest of endurance, and while Karen wielded influence and deception, he had something she could never imitate: precision, patience, and the unshakable discipline of a man who had built his life on foundations meant to endure storms. When he shut his door and returned to his study, he did not feel triumphant, only alert. The escalation was undeniable, and the mansion across the street glowed faintly in the night like a stage waiting for its final act. The night the conflict reached its peak began without incident. A quiet evening when Michael had settled into the rhythm of routine, a book open on his desk, the steady hum of his generator whispering in the background. Yet there was a restlessness in the air, a pressure he could not name, and when the lights in his home flickered, not a failure but a disruption, he knew instinctively that something was happening outside. He stepped into the darkness of his yard, the cool air sharp against his skin, and moved along the boundary line with the same calm precision he had carried through every stage of his career. There, half hidden by the hedge, he found him. Ethan crouched over the soil with a tool in his hand, working quickly to reconnect the splice that Michael had sealed days earlier. The man did not flinch when Michael's shadow fell over him. Instead, he straightened, slow and deliberate, and for the first time their eyes met without pretense. "You've been stealing from me," Michael said, his voice steady, neither loud nor trembling. Ethan's expression was unreadable, a mask of someone long practiced in silence, but his grip on the tool tightened before he slipped it into his pocket. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," he replied, the words low, almost detached. Michael stepped closer, the weight of years of restraint carried in his voice. "I understand enough. This is my house, my system, my work. You and she have turned it into your game, and it ends now." For a long moment, the two men stood in the quiet tension of the yard, the glow of Michael's house behind him and the looming shadow of Karen's mansion beyond. Then Karen herself appeared, stepping quickly down her driveway as though she had been waiting for the moment to unfold. Her face, framed by the harsh light of Michael's flood lamps, was no longer polished with charm, but drawn tight with fear and fury. "Stop this, both of you," she hissed, her eyes darting between them. "Michael, you don't know what you're dealing with. Ethan isn't—" She cut herself short, but the slip was enough. The pretense of family, of a harmless guest, crumbled in the space of a breath. Michael turned toward her, his voice harder now. "No, Karen. You're the one who doesn't understand. You thought you could forge papers, spread lies, and carve into my work as if none of it mattered. You thought authority was yours to imitate. But authority doesn't lie in signatures or stolen power. It lies in truth, and the truth is standing here." He gestured toward the exposed splice, the wires stripped bare, the evidence undeniable. Karen's composure broke at last. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a desperate plea. "Don't make this official. Don't bring others into it. We can fix this quietly." Michael studied her with the measured stillness of a man who had already made his choice. "You crossed my line when you cut into what I built. You crossed it again when you dragged him into it. There's no quiet left, Karen. You've already invited the noise." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the small device he rarely used except for emergencies, and placed a call not to the local police, not to the HOA, but to a federal office whose number he still kept from his professional days. He spoke only a few words, gave his address, and ended the call, his tone calm, final. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Karen's face drained of color as realization settled in, and Ethan's mask finally cracked, his jaw tightening with the recognition that the stage had shifted beyond their control. None of them spoke as the minutes passed, the only sound the steady thrum of Michael's generator, a heartbeat of independence that had become the measure of the entire conflict. When the unmarked vehicles arrived, silent, deliberate, their headlights dimmed, there were no raised voices, no scenes for the neighbors to witness. 2 men stepped out, their movements efficient, and Karen and Ethan were escorted away without resistance. Her eyes met Michael's one last time, not with hatred but with a hollow resignation, the look of someone who had gambled everything on influence and lost to patience. Michael stood alone in his yard as the vehicles disappeared into the distance, the night returning to its ordinary stillness. He looked once more at the severed splice, at the soil disturbed by careless hands, and felt no triumph, only the exhaustion of a man who had defended what was his without ever asking for the battle. The lights of his house glowed steadily behind him, and across the street the Holloway mansion sat in silence, stripped of its glow, no longer a monument, but an empty shell. For the first time in months, Michael felt the weight lift from his chest, not because he had won, but because the truth had been allowed to surface, and, once truth emerged, it could not be buried again. In the days that followed, the neighborhood adjusted to the absence of Karen Holloway with a mixture of curiosity and unease, the once constant glow of her mansion replaced by a silence that seemed to swallow the entire end of the street. Rumors surfaced quickly. Some claimed she had left for Europe to settle old family matters. Others whispered that her finances had collapsed and she was forced to abandon the house. But Michael knew better than to lend weight to speculation. He had seen the way she was taken that night, the quiet efficiency of men who did not answer to homeowners' committees or local gossip, and he understood that Karen's story had reached its conclusion far beyond the boundaries of their cul-de-sac. The mansion remained shuttered, its windows dark, and each time he passed it on his evening walks he felt no satisfaction, only the sober recognition that pride and deception had reduced a monument of vanity to nothing more than an empty shell. For Michael, life returned to its familiar rhythm, though it carried a subtle difference. The way air feels after a storm has passed, heavy with the memory of violence, yet clearer for its absence. He rose early, tended to his systems, and took quiet meals at the same kitchen table where his wife had once sat, but there was no longer the weight of watching eyes across the street. The neighbors, sensing that the feud had ended, began to greet him again with tentative warmth, their earlier hesitation giving way to relief that the turmoil which had unsettled their community had disappeared as suddenly as it had begun. He accepted their gestures politely but did not linger. He had no interest in retelling the conflict or reshaping it into a parable. What mattered to him was not the story but the fact that his independence remained intact, unbroken despite sabotage, lies, and theft. One evening, as the sun fell low and the air cooled with the onset of autumn, Michael stood at the edge of his yard and looked at his house, its lights glowing softly against the darkening sky. It no longer felt like defiance or a beacon meant to provoke. It felt like balance, a simple affirmation that he could live on his own terms. He thought of Karen then, not with anger, but with the detached clarity of someone who had survived her storm, and he realized that her power had never been real, only borrowed from the fear and compliance of others. Without that, she was nothing more than a shadow, and shadows vanish when light remains steady. With that thought, he turned back inside, closed the door, and allowed himself the rare comfort of peace, knowing that the house he built had once again proved stronger than the storm.